Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled to have you joining us. Today we're turning our attention to an incredibly rich and frankly a pretty challenging set of ideas compiled in a document called the Collaboration and Collective Impact Lab.
It is a dense one for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And right at the top, I do want to clarify something for you. This is a comprehensive guide originally tailored for ministry and faith-based leaders.
Right.
But if you don't work in a church or a ministry, please do not tune out. Because the organizational psychology, the behavioral economics, the leadership insights packed into these pages, they are absolute gold for anyone.
Yeah, the dynamics of how human beings organize themselves.
Or fail to organize themselves.
Right, exactly, how they fail to organize themselves. Those dynamics are entirely universal. The specific backdrop of this material might be the modern church, but the lessons on trust, territorialism, and shared vision, they map perfectly onto a tech startup, a sprawling nonprofit, or a Fortune 500 boardroom. It really just comes down to the friction of human collaboration.
Okay, let's unpack this. What if the greatest obstacle to your organization's impact isn't a lack of resources? What if it isn't the economy or outside opposition or, a shrinking quarterly budget? What if the absolute biggest threat to your mission is actually your own quiet default acceptance of working completely alone?
That is the core provocation we're dealing with today. The authors describe this phenomenon as fragmentation by default.
Fragmentation by default.
Yeah, just look at the world we live in. The challenges communities face today, whether that's a localized mental health crisis, systemic poverty, youth disengagement, they are deeply layered and interconnected.
Very complex.
Exactly. Yet, leaders across all sectors, and perhaps especially in mission-driven fields, tend to operate in these invisible, self-contained silos. They unintentionally equate their faithfulness, their dedication, with total independence.
Like a lone wolf mentality.
Totally. The internal monologue is usually something like, if I just put my head down, aggressively protect my vision, and work incredibly hard in my own lane, I'm being a responsible leader. But that very instinct quietly undermines the overarching mission they're so desperately trying to protect.
Which brings us to the actual mission of this deep dive. Over the next few minutes, we're going to explore the psychology behind why well-meaning people build these silos in the first place. We'll look at the hidden systemic costs of this siloed faithfulness. And most importantly, we are going to outline the practical, actionable frameworks you actually need to move from a mindset of passive competition to a reality of collective impact.
To really set the stage, though, we have to look at the modern landscape, which is defined by this massive paradox of abundance.
Looking at the landscape today, you'd think we have it all figured out. I mean, never in human history has there been such a staggering abundance of resources. Think about it. We have highly trained leaders, global digital platforms, endless data analytics.
Massive communication networks.
Exactly. And significant financial capital moving around. By any external surface-level metric, there is immense vitality. The energy output of our organizations is incredibly high, but the actual alignment is painfully low.
Yeah, activity's buzzing everywhere, but the measurable systemic impact feels entirely uneven.
Uneven is the perfect word for it.
And that unevenness leads to a state of what the source calls functional disunity. Now, when you hear the word disunity, your mind probably jumps to open conflict.
Yeah, you picture executives shouting in boardrooms or massive theological schisms.
Or nasty public turf wars on social media. But the reality is far more subtle. The most damaging forms of disunity are actually polite, professional, and entirely peaceful.
Wow. Polite and peaceful disunity.
Yeah, it's organizations acting as parallel kingdoms. They aren't fighting. They're just completely ignoring each other. You have two nonprofits replicating the exact same programs within 3 blocks of one another. They're competing for the exact same pool of volunteers.
Duplicating administrative overhead.
All while smiling and shaking hands at the local Rotary Club.
So wait, if I'm a nonprofit director or a ministry leader, what does that actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon? Is that me looking at a neighboring organization's latest initiative and privately feeling threatened instead of collaborative? Like, are they basically playing in the same sandbox but fiercely guarding their own plastic shovels?
That is exactly what it looks like on the ground. And what makes this deep dive so compelling is that the source material doesn't just treat this polite ignoring of one another as a mere managerial inefficiency. It anchors this deeply in theology and purpose. What's fascinating here is how the source looks at the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 17.
Oh, the prayer of the garden.
Right. On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus prays for his followers. But he doesn't just pray for their internal emotional harmony or that they would simply, get along. He prays that they would be one so that the world may
So
believe.
that the world may believe.
Yes. In that framework, unity isn't an optional feel-good add-on to the mission. It is an evidentiary public apologetic. It is the missional strategy itself. The credibility of the message is visibly tied to the relational coherence of the community that's proclaiming it.
Right.
When the community is fractured, the message loses its coherence entirely.
That perfectly connects to the Apostle Paul's famous metaphor from his first letter to the Corinthians. He compares a community to a physical, biological body. The eye cannot look at the hand and say, I don't need you. Spiritual gifts, and by extension, any individual talents or organizational strengths, they presuppose dependence by their very design.
They absolutely do.
It's a pretty visceral, almost horror movie image, right? A severed hand sitting on a table might technically keep its shape for a little while, but it's completely lifeless. It isn't opening any jars. Applied to leadership, going rogue and isolating yourself isn't a superpower. It isn't a sign of laser focus. It is literally pathological. It is a loss of function.
It's a profound paradigm shift. To sever yourself from the larger ecosystem, to just do your own thing, is a fundamental degradation of your purpose.
Let's bring this down to earth with a real-world example from the text. Imagine two neighboring churches or community centers in the exact same city. Unbeknownst to each other, the leadership teams at both locations notice a cluster of families severely struggling in their shared neighborhood.
What?
Organization A decides to launch a massive, well-funded food distribution program. Organization B decides to establish a dedicated, highly trained counseling and mental health clinic. They both work tirelessly. They both exhaust their staff recruiting volunteers. But they never cross the street to talk to each other.
And what is the actual downstream effect on the families they're trying to help?
Well, the families remain totally stuck in a fragmented system. They are fed by Organization A, but they remain completely overwhelmed by the underlying trauma and instability that caused the food insecurity in the first place. Or, conversely, they're receiving excellent counseling at Organization B, but their home life remains incredibly unstable because they literally do not have enough calories to get through the week.
It's heartbreaking.
It is a classic, tragic case of parallel faithfulness resulting in diminished, fragmented fruit. If those two directors had just communicated, they could have offered a comprehensive, holistic support system.
Which naturally forces us to ask, if the benefits of working together are so painfully obvious and the costs of working alone are so high, why don't we do it? Why do passionate, incredibly smart leaders spend so much energy building walls?
I really want you, the listener, to pause and reflect on this in the context of your own career. If you look under the hood of why we build these silos, you start to see a few recurring psychological traps. The first is a profound fear of scarcity. It is that zero-sum anxiety. It's the director sweating over a spreadsheet, terrified that if they partner with the group down the street, they're going to bleed out their donor base, lose their best volunteers, or cannibalize their own attendance numbers.
Another massive factor is past trauma. We often overlook the organizational scar tissue that leaders carry. Many people have unhealed wounds from previous bad partnerships. Maybe they tried to collaborate a decade ago and it ended in gross mismanagement.
Or stolen credit.
Or a very public, messy falling out. Because of that, they develop a hardened institutional defensiveness. They subconsciously assume that betrayal or incompetence is inevitable, so they keep their walls extremely high to protect their team.
Yeah. And then you have the trap of a performance-based identity. This is incredibly common. It happens when a leader's entire sense of self-worth becomes inextricably tied to their internal metrics, their attendance numbers, their budget size, or how visible their personal brand is in the community.
Right.
When your core identity is on the line, sharing credit doesn't just feel like bad business. It feels like a direct, existential threat to your value as a human being.
Those are very human, very understandable psychological barriers. But in the context of ministry or even mission-driven nonprofits, those raw fears often get dressed up in a much more sophisticated language.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Leaders are brilliant at masking their control anxiety with spiritual or mission-centric jargon. If you suggest a partnership, they won't say, I'm terrified of losing my spotlight. Instead, they will say things like, well, we really need to protect our unique calling.
Or I'm worried about mission drift.
Yes, or we just don't feel led to step into that space right now. But beneath that highly polished, spiritualized language, they're usually just terrified of losing control, diluting their brand, or having to share their unilateral authority.
The term for this is functional worldliness.
Functional worldliness.
Yeah. It happens when a church or charity or a community initiative unconsciously begins to mirror the cutthroat marketplace. Instead of operating on kingdom logic, which fundamentally demands shared sacrifice, mutual edification, and the willing surrender of control, they start using Wall Street logic.
Yeah.
They start obsessing over market share, brand differentiation, and competing for the same customers as the charity next door. They treat human restoration as a competitive sport.
But I love how we pivot here, because the solution isn't some modern corporate buzzword. Collaboration isn't a concept that McKinsey consultants recently retrofitted for the church or the nonprofit sector. Expansion through radical unity is deeply, fundamentally historical.
The historical precedents are genuinely staggering. If you look at the Book of Acts in the first century, a severe famine hit the region of Judea. The Gentile congregations located in places like Antioch didn't just send thoughts and prayers.
Right.
Despite being culturally distinct and geographically distant, they mobilized and sent coordinated trans-regional financial relief. Their shared faith created an immediate, tangible, shared burden. It was an incredibly sophisticated early network of collective action.
And look at the logistics of the Apostle Paul. He spent years of his life coordinating a massive financial collection for the impoverished church in Jerusalem. And he did this across multiple geographic regions, negotiating with different cultures, all without modern banking, the internet, or rapid transit.
It's incredible to think about.
He proved that unity at scale doesn't just happen by accident. It requires intentional design, relentless communication, and a profound willingness to share resources across established boundaries.
You see this same dynamic centuries later with the Moravians in the 1700s. They were a relatively small, persecuted movement with very limited financial resources, yet they became a massive, unprecedented global missionary force. How did a tiny group pull that off?
How did they?
Because they radically collaborated through a division of labor. Different Moravian congregations deliberately specialized in complementary strengths. Some communities dedicated themselves entirely to continuous, around-the-clock prayer. Others focused exclusively on the economics, running businesses to generate funding. And others focused entirely on the field work and deployment.
They didn't fall into the trap of everyone trying to do everything. Imagine the friction of a community saying, we are only going to fundraise, and we are going to trust that other group completely with the field work. That requires immense trust.
Absolutely. And the synthesized takeaway here is vital. Unity concentrates energy. It sustains endurance because the heavy lifting is distributed. And it clarifies the organization's witness to the outside world. History repeatedly proves that fragmentation slows organizational expansion down to a crawl, but intentional unity multiplies it exponentially.
Okay, so the theology demands it, the psychology explains the resistance, and history proves it actually works. But how do we pull this off today? How do we move from theory to practical action? The very first framework the document provides is about aligning hearts before you attempt to align structures.
Because strategy cannot replace trust. That is an immutable law for any organization. Trust is the absolute foundational currency of collaboration. And one of the most profound insights here is that speed is the natural enemy of trust. If you try to rush a complex partnership just to get a shiny new program off the ground by Q3, it will inevitably collapse under the very first sign of stress.
There's this amazing story in the text that perfectly illustrates this. It's about a group of 30 pastors in a Midwestern city who decided they needed to work together. But they didn't launch a program. They didn't draft a strategic plan. They didn't even bring a whiteboard.
No whiteboards allowed.
None. They committed to meeting weekly for 2 entire years just to pray together. Can you imagine the friction of that? 30 Type A leaders sitting in a room doing, quote-unquote, nothing measurable for 24 months.
It goes against every leadership instinct we're taught.
Exactly. But over those 2 years, they built such a deep relational infrastructure that when they finally did act, it organically birthed massive, highly coordinated disaster relief efforts and citywide initiatives. And because the egos had already been dealt with in that room, there were absolutely zero turf wars.
Once that relational bedrock is in place, you can move to the second framework, vision mapping and complementary strengths. This is the process of putting your cards on the table to discover where your missions overlap and, crucially, where your operational strengths differ.
This is such a brilliant aha moment. It is the realization that you should be identifying your specific strengths rather than blindly duplicating what someone else is already doing well. Think about 2 organizations that both have competing parallel youth mentorship programs. They're constantly fighting for the same limited pool of Saturday morning volunteers.
Right.
Finally, they sit down and actually map out their competencies. Organization A realizes they are fantastic at academic tutoring and test prep. Organization B realizes they actually excel at emotional character development and life skills.
So instead of fighting for market share, they merge their pipelines. Organization A handles the academic side, Organization B handles the mentorship side. By combining forces and staying in their respective lanes of genius, they go from serving 50 youth in a mediocre way to serving 150 youth with excellence. They didn't lose their individual identities, they maximized their collective impact.
But to sustain that kind of momentum, you have to completely change how you define winning.
That brings us to the third practical framework, shared measurement systems. I want to challenge you as you listen to this to think deeply about how you measure success in your own daily work. We have to fundamentally shift away from internal metrics, like how many people showed up to my specific event or how many subscribers my newsletter gained, and move toward collective metrics.
Right. What if success was measured by tracking how many duplicated events across the entire city were successfully eliminated this year? Or measuring the drop in the high school dropout rate across an entire zip code, rather than just counting how many kids walk through the front doors of your specific building?
But measuring things collectively and sharing your hard-earned volunteers requires a terrifying level of commitment. A casual handshake over coffee and a promise to keep in touch isn't going to hold up when the budget gets tight or a crisis hits.
You have to move from casual cooperation to an actual covenant. A handshake is fine for a networking event, but for deep collaboration, you need what is called a partnership covenant. This isn't just a cold legal contract designed to protect assets. It is a structured, living document that clearly outlines your shared theological or philosophical foundations.
It acts as a baseline.
Yeah. It dictates your agreed-upon mission focus, sets exact predetermined pathways for how you will resolve conflicts when they inevitably happen, and establishes a strict schedule for reviewing the partnership. It acts as a necessary guardrail. It protects the fragile relationship from individual egos, staff turnover, and mission drift.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, entering into a covenant like that is incredibly costly to a leader's ego. The phrase used to describe this is cruciform leadership. It means leadership that is fundamentally shaped by sacrifice. True collaboration demands that you choose patience over speed, taking the agonizing time to build consensus even when your instinct is to just dictate a solution and move fast.
It demands dialogue over decree. You can't just hand down edicts from the corner office. You have to actively share your authority.
And it demands humility over prominence. You have to be willing to do the heavy lifting behind the scenes and then step back and let another leader or another organization be the public face of a successful initiative that you helped build.
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, it means a total foundational paradigm shift. You have to change your mental framework from believing you have ownership of a mission to realizing you simply have stewardship of a mission. You don't own the work. You're just managing a small piece of it alongside a much larger community.
Which is a remarkably freeing concept when you truly internalize it. You don't have to carry the weight of the entire world on your shoulders alone.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's trace the journey we've taken today. We've explored how our default, comfortable setting of isolation actively dilutes our impact in a complex world. We've seen how internal psychological fears, scarcity, trauma, and ego, combined with a hyper-competitive marketplace mentality, cause us to build protective walls instead of bridges. But we've also seen the historical proof and the practical way forward. By utilizing intentional tools like prolonged relationship building, vision mapping, shared metrics, and binding covenants, a fragmented, exhausted group of leaders can transform into a unified, multiplying force.
And whether you are leading a ministry, managing a fast-paced corporate engineering team, or organizing a grassroots community project, the core question remains exactly the same. Are you willing to settle for isolated, limited success where you get all the credit? Or are you willing to pay the necessary, painful price of patience, humility, and shared control to achieve true collective impact?
It is a heavy, challenging question, and it's one we want to leave you with today. But before you sign off, I want to offer one final provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We have talked extensively today about how your organizational structure, your silos, and your reluctance to collaborate impact your outcomes and your stress levels as a leader. But consider the vulnerable people you are actually trying to serve. If it is true that the medium is the message, what happens when the communities you are trying to help begin to unconsciously mimic the siloed, territorial, and fiercely competitive behaviors of the very organizations that are trying to save them. What is your operational structure secretly teaching your community about how human beings are supposed to live together? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.